I remember the exact frequency at which our auger arrays first detected the signal. A repeating data burst, transmitting on channels that should not have existed. Electromagnetic patterns bleeding through real space from coordinates deep within the Hadros Rift, where no imperial authority had ventured for 3,000 years. The signal carried the unmistakable syntax of standard template construct encoding protocols, fragmented and corrupted, but undeniably authentic, representing technological knowledge from the Dark Age when humanity commanded powers that would shame even the Omnissiah's most sacred mysteries. I was Magos Explorator Veridin Cross, 47 standard years old and already 2/3 augmetic by volume. Standing on the command deck of the Quest for Comprehension, with 17 other tech priests monitoring data streams that promised everything our Explorator fleet had been searching for across 2 centuries of void travel. The air in the command sanctum was precisely maintained at 18 degrees Celsius, carrying the scent of consecrated machine oils and the ozone of active power relays. And through my 16 enhanced sensory organs, I perceived the moment with a clarity that purely biological consciousness could never achieve. We had found an STC signal. We had discovered the holy grail of Mechanicus exploration. Actual technological data from humanity's golden age, preserved impossibly in a region controlled by the ruinous powers. The choice before us was simple and terrible. Enter chaos-held space to recover sacred technology, or turn away and abandon knowledge that could reshape the Imperium. We entered the Hadros Rift 6 days later, and the slow corruption that would transform us from loyal servants of Mars into something unrecognizable began the moment we accepted our first trade agreement with entities we should have destroyed on sight. The Adeptus Mechanicus does not produce explorators who understand philosophical compromise or moral ambiguity. We are raised in the forge temples of Mars and its subsidiary forge worlds, our biological components systematically replaced with sanctified augmetics from our first decade onward. Our consciousness shaped by the cult Mechanicus's doctrines until our thoughts flow in binary and theological calculation rather than emotion and intuition. We are taught that all knowledge is holy, that the recovery of lost technology is the highest calling, that the machine god's mysteries must be pursued regardless of danger or cost. We learn to value data over human life, including our own, and to assess every situation through equations of resource expenditure versus technological gain. The Quest for Comprehension was the flagship of Explorator Fleet Tertius 9. A vessel 3 kilometers long and massing approximately 4 million tons, its interior a labyrinth of research laboratories, forge sanctums, data crypts, and worship chambers where we conducted our sacred research into technological mysteries. Our fleet comprised 17 vessels, ranging from the massive flagship down to smaller survey ships and defensive escorts, carrying a total complement of 8,347 souls, though souls might be inaccurate given that most of us were more machine than flesh by the time we reached the Hadros Rift. I had served as Magos Explorator for 23 years. Elevated to that rank after recovering a functional plasma reactor design from a derelict space hulk at considerable personal cost. The mission had required me to sacrifice both legs and my left arm to explosive decompression, but the technology gained justified the loss, and the subsequent augmetic replacements improved my functionality beyond biological baselines. My body was now primarily adamantium and blessed steel. My organs replaced with more efficient mechanical systems, my sensory inputs enhanced through a dozen different augmetic organs that perceived reality in Spectrum's biological eyes could never register. I retained my original brain, heavily modified with neural implants and cognitive processors, and approximately 23% of my original organic mass distributed through redundant systems that kept me technically human, according to the most generous definitions. I thought of myself as improved rather than diminished, my flesh's weakness steadily eliminated in favor of the purity of the machine. The Omnissiah's plan for humanity was gradual transformation toward mechanical perfection, and I was further along that sacred path than most. The STC signal led us deep into the Hadros Rift, through warp routes that our navigators reported as dangerously unstable, where the barrier between Materium and Immaterium grew thin enough that reality itself became negotiable. We emerged in a system that should not have existed. 3 planets orbiting a star that burned with colors wrong enough to damage unshielded optics, their surfaces marked by structures that combined Imperial architecture with geometries that violated Euclidean principles, in ways that made my augmetic targeting systems malfunction. The Augur returns showed extensive industrial development, forge complexes and manufactory installations that rivaled those on Mars itself, all operating under power signatures that included components we recognized as chaos corruption, alongside genuine Mechanicus engineering. This was Chaos Space Marine territory, specifically controlled by the Iron Warriors Legion according to our tactical analysis, and standard Mechanicus doctrine demanded immediate withdrawal and notification of proper military authorities. Except the STC signal was coming from the primary planet's northern continent, broadcasting continuously from coordinates that our analysis indicated was a functional data repository from the Dark Age. The prize was literally within reach, technology that could revolutionize the Imperium's manufacturing capacity, weapons designs that could turn the tide of the Long War, possibly even construction templates for systems we had spent 10,000 years trying to reverse engineer from fragmentary remains. All we had to do was recover it from a planet controlled by traitor Marines, who would certainly attempt to prevent our acquisition unless we could negotiate an alternative arrangement. Magos Logis Thurank, my second in command and a specialist in tactical probability assessment, calculated our odds of successful combat extraction at approximately 0.37%. His logic was irrefutable. We were an exploration fleet, lightly armed relative to our size, facing Chaos Space Marines who controlled the entire system and could deploy military assets that would overwhelm us within hours of hostile action. Combat was not viable. Withdrawal was the orthodox response. Or we could attempt negotiation, establish contact with the system's rulers, and determine if an arrangement could be reached that allowed technological recovery without requiring military confrontation we could not win. Margot's Explorator, Thurank said through the noospheric link we shared, his thoughts carrying the flat precision of pure data exchange. Analysis indicates 0.0004 probability that chaos forces will negotiate in good faith. However, Iron Warriors demonstrate tactical pragmatism and interest in material resources rather than purely ideological corruption. Proposal: initiate contact. Offer trade goods from our resource reserves in exchange for STC data access. Worst case, they attack as they would have anyway. Best case, we acquire sacred technology through economic exchange. The logic was seductive because it was purely logical, stripped of the emotional and moral considerations that biological thinking would prioritize. We were not proposing alliance with chaos or adoption of their corruption. We were proposing a transaction, an exchange of resources for data that both parties valued. The Iron Warriors wanted material goods we possessed, refined metals, advanced components, possibly technological information we had acquired, but they had not. We wanted the STC data they controlled. A trade was rational, efficient, and achievable where military action was not. The fact that our trading partners served the ruinous powers was, from a purely technical perspective, irrelevant to the transaction's validity. I authorized contact protocols 6 hours after entering the system, transmitting on Mechanicus frequencies rather than Imperial military channels, identifying ourselves as Explorator Fleet Tertius, 9 operating under the authority of Mars and the Omnissiah, and requesting negotiation for technological data access. The response came within minutes, not an attack, but a data packet containing coordinates for an orbital facility and a text-only message in perfect lingua technis. Your request is acknowledged. Bring samples of your resource inventory. We will assess trade viability. The warsmith does not waste ammunition on those who offer profit. If this glimpse into rationalized compromise already weighs on your conscience, leave the word logic in the comments. bear witness to how corruption begins with pure calculation. The Iron Warrior's orbital station was a structure of brutal efficiency, all right angles and reinforced armor, with none of the decorative elements or symbolic architecture that characterized proper Mechanicus installations. It massed approximately 1.3 million tons, bristled with weapon batteries that could have vaporized our flagship with a sustained barrage, and radiated power signatures indicating technological sophistication that matched our own. They had maintained their equipment and knowledge base across 10,000 years of warp exposure and continuous warfare, which was simultaneously impressive and heretical. I led the delegation personally, accompanied by Magos Logis Tharank and 4 Skutari guards whose augmetic warriors, whose loyalty protocols made them marginally more reliable than servitors in situations requiring judgment. We took a small shuttle loaded with sample crates, refined adamantium, processed ceramite, rare earth elements, advanced circuitry components, and a sealed data core containing technical specifications for Imperial Guard equipment patterns that were not classified above our clearance level. The Iron Warriors who met us in the station's docking bay were Space Marines whose power armor bore evidence of 10 millennia of warfare. Layer upon layer of repairs, modifications, and enhancements that had gradually transformed their war gear into something that retained its original structure but incorporated technologies and aesthetics that were distinctly non-imperial. Their armor was covered in bronze trim and iron rivets, chain-wrapped reinforcement, spikes that served structural purposes but created disturbing silhouettes, and occasional brass elements whose color was wrong in ways that suggested warp taint rather than simple metallic composition. They carried weapons that I recognized as bolt guns, but modified extensively with cooling systems and firing mechanisms that differed from standard patterns. Their leader introduced himself as Warsmith Krendath, his voice emerging from his helmet's Vox grill with mechanical precision. "Magos Cross," he said, my name data accessible to him through means I could not immediately identify. "You seek the STC repository on the planet below. It contains genuine Dark Age technology, construction templates for manufacturing systems your Imperium has spent millennia failing to recreate. We control access to this facility, but have no use for most of its contents. The Warsmith maintains it because destroying knowledge is illogical, not because we require additional manufacturing capacity. You may access this repository in exchange for resources we can immediately utilize. Show me what you offer." The negotiation lasted 3 hours, conducted in a mixture of lingua technis and binary that allowed for precise technical specifications. The Iron Warriors wanted refined materials for their own manufacturing operations, specifically high-grade adamantium for armor fabrication, processed promethium for weapon systems, and advanced electronics components for void ship repairs. They had extensive mining operations but limited refining capacity, and they valued finished materials more highly than raw ores. Our fleet carried substantial reserves of exactly these resources, stockpiled for our own use during extended exploration, but not immediately necessary for survival. The trade was straightforward. We would provide 200 tons of refined adamantium, 50,000 liters of processed promethium, and selected electronics components, all deliverable immediately from our holds. In exchange, we would receive unrestricted access to the STC repository for 1 standard week, with permission to copy any data we could process in that time frame, and safe conduct assurances for the duration. Warsmith Krendath's terms were surprisingly professional. He wanted verification that our goods met specifications. Entirely reasonable. He insisted on delivery before we received access. Standard practice for establishing trust in uncertain transactions. He offered to provide technical assistance if we encountered difficulties accessing the repository's data formats. Genuinely helpful if his motives were purely transactional. The entire negotiation felt like dealing with a rogue trader or tech cartel rather than Chaos Space Marines. There was no theological argument, no attempt at corruption or conversion, no demonic presence or warp phenomena. Just practical discussion of resource exchange conducted by warriors who had been fighting for 10,000 years, and understood that sometimes trade was more efficient than combat. I accepted the deal. The decision required approximately 0.4 seconds of processing through my cognitive implants, running probability calculations and risk assessments that all pointed toward the same conclusion. We could acquire genuine STC technology through simple resource exchange, suffering no casualties, and expending only materials we could replace. Or we could refuse on moral grounds and return to Mars empty-handed after 2 centuries of searching. The choice was obvious to anyone who valued technological advancement over abstract principles about appropriate trading partners. We were not allying with chaos. We were conducting a transaction. The distinction seemed significant. The STC repository exceeded our most optimistic projections. It contained functional templates for 37 different manufacturing systems, including plasma reactor designs that were 15% more efficient than current Mechanicus patterns, armor fabrication techniques that produced ceramite with improved impact resistance, and, most valuable, construction specifications for a fusion power plant that could be built using materials available in any moderately developed industrial system. These were genuine Dark Age technologies, preserved in data formats our cogitator systems could access and copy, exactly what we had been searching for across decades of void travel. My team worked continuously for 6 days, translating ancient technical specifications into formats our systems could process, verifying that the templates were complete and functional, calculating the revolutionary impact these designs would have on Imperial manufacturing capacity once we returned to Mars. Warsmith Krendath visited the repository on our 3rd day of access, observing our work with what I interpreted as professional interest. He stood in his power armor among our tech priests, his helm's optics tracking our data extraction processes, and he spoke with the tone of someone offering collegial advice. "You are efficient in your methods, Magos Cross. Your team demonstrates proper respect for ancient technology. This repository contains knowledge we preserved because destroying it would be waste, but which we cannot fully utilize due to our current operational requirements. That you can employ these designs for productive purposes makes this exchange more satisfying than simply hoarding data we will never implement. Practical cooperation is always preferable to pointless conflict. Yes?" I agreed because his logic was sound. We were not corrupted by this interaction. We were cooperating with an entity that happened to serve chaos but was behaving rationally and professionally. The Warsmith was not trying to convert us or seduce us into damnation. He was conducting business, trading resources he controlled for resources he needed, operating according to pragmatic rather than ideological motivations. That such an arrangement was technically heretical seemed increasingly irrelevant compared to the tangible benefits we were acquiring. We departed the Hadros Rift 7 days later with data holds containing technological treasures beyond calculation. Having traded materials we could replace for knowledge that would reshape the Imperium. Our entire fleet understood that this transaction was officially unsanctioned. We had negotiated with traitor Marines, entered chaos-held territory, and acquired technology through channels that would not withstand orthodox review. But we also understood that results mattered more than methodology, that the technology we had recovered justified our unorthodox approach, and that we could present our findings to Mars in ways that minimized how we had acquired them. Knowledge was knowledge, regardless of source. The Omnissiah cared about the recovery of sacred technology, not about the purity of the chain of custody. We had succeeded where orthodox methods would have failed, and that success validated our approach even if we could not officially document it. Should explorators value results over methodology? Let your like be an answer to the question we rationalized without asking. The second trade occurred 18 months later, after we had begun cataloging and analyzing the STC templates and recognized that several contained references to related technologies not included in the repository. Specifically, the fusion power plant design referenced a cooling system whose specifications were incomplete in our data, and the plasma reactor template required control mechanisms whose details were fragmentary. The missing information limited the utility of what we had acquired. We could build these systems but not optimize them, implement them but not achieve their full potential. Standard procedure would be to research the missing components through traditional mechanicus methods, potentially taking decades to develop equivalent solutions through trial and error. Or we could return to the Hadros Rift and ask the Iron Warriors if their archives contained the referenced technologies. It was a logical solution to a practical problem. We had established a working relationship with Warsmith Krendath's forces, proven ourselves reliable trading partners, and demonstrated that cooperation could be mutually beneficial. The previous transaction had involved no corruption or conversion attempts. It had been purely professional, exactly as the Warsmith had presented it. Returning for additional trade seemed reasonable, especially since we now had 18 months of exploration data and recovered materials that could serve as payment for further technological access. Magos biologist Carnex raised objections during the Fleet Council, where I proposed the return voyage. Carnex retained more biological components than most of our senior tech priests, and he seemed prone to the emotional reasoning that purely organic consciousness generated. He argued that repeated contact with chaos forces represented escalating risk, that we were establishing patterns of interaction that normalized relationships with the ruinous powers. That gradual compromise was how corruption typically progressed. His concerns were noted and logged, but ultimately overruled by pragmatic calculation. The technology we could acquire was worth more than abstract concerns about normalization of abnormal relationships. We were not being corrupted. We were being efficient. The second trade was larger and more complex than the first. We traded refined materials again, 500 tons of various metals and components, plus complete data cores containing our exploration survey results from 17 systems the Iron Warriors had expressed interest in monitoring. In exchange, we received access to technical archives containing the missing specifications for the STC systems we had previously acquired, plus additional design templates for defensive weapons, manufacturing equipment, and, most significantly, details on demon engine construction principles that Warsmith Krendath claimed were theoretically interesting even if you lack the ideological framework to implement them fully. The demon engine data was where we should have recognized our compromise was becoming corruption. The technical specifications described methods for binding warp entities into mechanical systems, using their essence as power sources and their consciousness as control mechanisms. The designs were elegant from an engineering perspective, highly efficient, remarkably stable, capable of performance that exceeded purely mechanical systems by orders of magnitude. They were also explicitly heretical, involving rituals and procedures that constituted both tech heresy and literal demonology. Orthodox Mechanicus doctrine demanded immediate destruction of such information and likely would have required our entire fleet to undergo purification protocols simply for having been exposed to it. Instead, we studied the data with professional interest. Magos Technicus Vorath pointed out that the daemon binding principles involved warp energy manipulation techniques that could potentially be adapted to purely mechanical applications if we understood the underlying physics. Magos Logis Tharank noted that several control mechanisms described in the daemon engine specifications solved persistent problems in our own plasma containment systems through methods that did not inherently require demonic involvement. I observed that knowledge itself was not corruption. Understanding how the enemy's technology functioned made us better equipped to counter it, and potentially allowed us to develop legitimate alternatives that achieved similar performance through orthodox means. We kept the data, logged it in secured archives with appropriate warning labels, and told ourselves we were being thorough researchers rather than compromised servants studying forbidden lore. The trades became routine. Over the next 5 years, we returned to the Hadros Rift 7 times, each visit involving progressively larger exchanges of resources and technology. We traded materials, equipment, and information for access to technical archives that the Iron Warriors controlled but did not need, recovering designs and specifications that would have taken the Mechanicus centuries to develop independently. Warsmith Krendath proved to be reliable. His word was binding, his trades were fair by objective assessment, and he never attempted overt corruption or demanded anything we considered truly unacceptable. He operated as a businessman who happened to serve chaos rather than as a corrupting influence actively attempting to damn us. The distinction felt meaningful even as it became increasingly difficult to maintain. Our fleet's composition began changing subtly around the third year of regular trading. We needed to carry more cargo to supply our increasingly ambitious trades, so we retrofitted several research vessels as transport ships, adding cargo holds and reducing laboratory space. The modifications followed designs the Iron Warriors had suggested during one negotiation, structurally efficient patterns that maximized volume while maintaining defensive capability. The new holds had an aesthetic that differed from standard Imperial architecture, more angular, more heavily reinforced, incorporating design elements that emphasized function over form in ways that felt different but not wrong. Our servitors implemented the changes according to the specifications we provided, and we did not recognize that we were beginning to adopt chaos aesthetic preferences because the changes were presented as optimization rather than stylistic choices. The more significant transformation involved our approach to technology itself. Traditional Mechanicus doctrine maintained strict prohibitions against innovation or deviation from approved patterns. We recovered ancient technology and preserved it in exactly the forms we found it, treating any modification as potential tech heresy. But the Iron Warriors' technical practices demonstrated that continuous improvement and adaptation were possible without losing functionality. That technologies could be modified and enhanced if you understood the underlying principles, rather than treating them as sacred mysteries. Their plasma weapons were more efficient than Imperial patterns because they had spent 10,000 years refining them. Their power armor was more resilient because they had incorporated lessons from millennia of warfare. They innovated constantly, treating technology as tools to be improved rather than relics to be preserved unchanged. We began adopting similar approaches, initially limiting ourselves to small optimizations of existing systems, but gradually becoming more ambitious as we recognized that careful modification produced measurable improvements. We enhanced our plasma reactors using cooling techniques adapted from Demon engine specifications, purely mechanical implementations that involved no actual demonic binding, but which borrowed control principles from those forbidden designs. We upgraded our weapons using materials science insights gained from analyzing Iron Warriors' equipment samples they had provided for study. We redesigned our ship's internal systems for better efficiency, implementing changes that sometimes departed from orthodox Mechanicus patterns, but which produced objectively superior performance. Each modification was rationalized as logical optimization rather than deviation from proper doctrine. Each change was small enough that it did not seem like a fundamental compromise. Each improvement was justified by measurable performance gains that validated our willingness to employ unorthodox methods. We were not being corrupted. We were being pragmatic, willing to learn from any source if the knowledge proved valuable, treating technology as something to be understood and improved rather than worshipped without comprehension. The fact that this represented a fundamental philosophical shift away from traditional Mechanicus doctrine was something we recognized intellectually, but dismissed practically, because our approach was producing results that orthodox methods could not match. The moment of transformation has begun. If you believe efficiency justifies methodology, or if you see the corruption we denied, comment where you're watching from. Bear witness to pragmatism's price. By year 7 of regular trading with the Iron Warriors, our fleet had become something that would have disturbed orthodox tech priests if they could have inspected us closely. Our ships retained their basic Imperial structure, but had been modified extensively with design elements borrowed from or inspired by Chaos Mechanicum practices. We employed demon engine principles in our power systems without actual demonic binding, using warp field generators that manipulated Immersive energies through mechanical means rather than summoned entities. Our aesthetics had shifted toward the angular, reinforced, spike-adorned style that characterized Iron Warrior's architecture, not because we worshipped chaos, but because we had come to appreciate the functional efficiency of those design patterns and had gradually adopted them through continuous small modifications. Our tech priests wore robes that incorporated brass trim and bronze decorative elements, not as religious symbols but as status indicators showing expertise with the advanced technologies we had mastered. We looked different from orthodox Mechanicus vessels, but every change had a rational explanation, a practical justification, a measurable benefit that validated the deviation. The daemon engines were where our rationalization fully crossed into damnation, though we would not recognize this truth for years. During our 11th trade mission, Warsmith Krendath offered to sell us 3 actual demon engines, fully functional Defiler-class war machines whose machine spirits were bound warp entities, providing power and consciousness. He explained that his forces had recently captured them from a rival warband and had no immediate use for duplicates of equipment they already possessed in sufficient quantity. The price was steep: 2,000 tons of refined materials, plus access to our recent exploration data. But the demon engines represented combat capability far beyond what our lightly armed exploration fleet could normally deploy. They would make us significantly more defensible if we encountered hostile forces during our travels. I should have refused immediately. Daemon engines were abominations, literal manifestations of chaos corruption bound into technological form. Possessing them constituted heresy. Operating them would require rituals that invoked the ruinous powers. There was no possible rationalization that made daemon engine ownership compatible with loyalty to the Imperium or the Omnissiah. Yet Warsmith Krendath's presentation emphasized their practical utility, their reliability in combat. The fact that the daemons were already bound and controlled through mechanisms we could learn to operate without requiring personal corruption. He demonstrated one of the Defiler's capabilities, showing how its weapons systems functioned, how its targeting protocols operated, how its demon consciousness could be directed through command inputs that did not require ritual invocation or worship. It was impressive, terrifying, and undeniably effective. Magos Logis Tharank ran probability calculations on fleet combat scenarios with and without demon engine support. The numbers were unambiguous. Possessing these weapons would increase our survival odds in hostile encounters by approximately 300%. Given that our primary mission was technology recovery, which required surviving long enough to return to Mars, acquiring defensive capabilities that dramatically improved our survival probability was logically justified even if the specific weapons were unorthodox. The daemon engines were tools, sophisticated and morally complicated tools, but ultimately just equipment that could be assessed based on performance characteristics rather than ideological purity. We purchased the daemon engines and integrated them into our fleet's defensive roster, assigning Magos Technicus Vorath and a specialized team to study their operation and maintenance requirements. The process of learning to control the Defilers required extensive interaction with their bound demon consciousness. Communication that involved speaking commands in languages that hurt to vocalize, and observing responses that demonstrated intelligence far beyond normal machine spirits. The daemons were constrained by their bindings, unable to directly corrupt their handlers, but clearly aware and capable of limited communication. They expressed preferences, demonstrated personality equivalence, and occasionally offered suggestions about tactical applications that were disturbingly insightful. Working with them felt wrong in ways that purely mechanical systems never did. But the wrongness was tolerable because the demon engines performed exactly as specified, providing combat capability we desperately needed without requiring any explicit worship or corruption of our personnel. The Imperium would have classified our possession of demon engines as immediate grounds for exterminatus. We classified it as a pragmatic security measure, documented in our logs as unorthodox defensive systems acquired through field necessity, and continued our operations with the understanding that some aspects of our activities could never be fully reported to Mars. We were walking a line between orthodoxy and heresy, that we believed we understood where that line was, and that we remained on the acceptable side through careful management of our compromises. We were wrong, but the wrongness accumulated so gradually that we never recognized the moment when we crossed from unorthodox to damned. Year 15 marked the point where external observers would have classified us as Chaos Mechanicum without hesitation, though we would not recognize this truth for another 5 years. Our fleet's aesthetic had fully transformed. Every vessel bore the angular, spike-adorned, brass-trimmed appearance that characterized Chaos architecture. Not through deliberate worship, but through 15 years of continuous optimization and modification, following design principles we had learned from the Iron Warriors. Our technical practices had diverged significantly from orthodox Mechanicus doctrine. We innovated constantly, employed demon engine technology routinely, modified sacred designs without seeking approval from Mars, and treated technology as something to be understood and improved rather than preserved in static reverence. Our tech priests wore robes that incorporated chaos aesthetic elements, used tools and equipment whose designs originated from traitor legions, and spoke technical languages that blended lingua technis with terms borrowed from Chaos Mechanicum usage. We employed warp field technology extensively, operated multiple demon engines as standard defensive assets, and maintained regular trading relationships with Iron Warriors forces across 3 different systems in the Hadros Rift region. Every individual change had been rationalized as logical optimization. Every compromise had been justified through practical benefit. Every deviation from orthodoxy had been explained as necessary adaptation to operational realities. Collectively, these changes had transformed us into something that resembled Chaos Mechanicum far more than loyal Mechanicus explorators. But because the transformation had been gradual, and every step had seemed reasonable in context, we never perceived ourselves as corrupted. We remained convinced that we were loyal servants of the Omnissiah who simply employed unorthodox methods for superior results. Our self-image had not updated to reflect our actual state, creating cognitive dissonance that we resolved by insisting that appearances were misleading, and our fundamental loyalty remained unchanged, despite our heterodox practices. Magos biologist Carnex disappeared during year 16, last observed entering a shuttle claiming he needed to collect biological samples from a world we were surveying. His shuttle returned on autopilot with a data core containing a single message. "I can no longer participate in what we have become. May the Omnissiah forgive us all." The message was logged and filed, but we did not investigate Carnex's fate or seriously examine his warning. He had always been prone to emotional reasoning, retaining too much biological consciousness, unable to assess situations with proper logical detachment. His departure was unfortunate, but not surprising given his persistent discomfort with our operational methodology. We replaced him with Magos biologist Vrask, who had no such qualms about our practices, and who immediately proved more pragmatic in his approach to biological research, using techniques we had learned from chaos sources. The Iron Warriors had become our primary trading partners, and our closest thing to allies in the Void. We maintained regular communication with Warsmith Krendath's forces, coordinated our exploration activities to avoid conflicts with their operational areas, shared intelligence about regions we had surveyed, and conducted increasingly sophisticated exchanges of technology and resources. The relationship was professional, mutually beneficial, and disturbingly comfortable. They treated us with respect, honored their agreements consistently, and never attempted overt corruption beyond providing access to technologies and techniques we chose to study and implement. We treated them as reliable business partners, valued their technical expertise, and found ourselves appreciating their approach to technology as something to be mastered rather than worshipped. The ideological differences remained. They served chaos while we remained loyal to the Imperium. But in practice, those differences seemed less significant than our shared interests in technological advancement and operational efficiency. Year 20 brought our first combat engagement against Imperial forces, and it was this incident that began forcing us to confront what we had become. We were surveying a system near the edge of the Hadros Rift when we encountered a Space Marine strike cruiser from the Silver Skulls chapter conducting anti-piracy operations. Standard procedure would be to hail them, identify ourselves as Mechanicus Explorators, and coordinate any necessary cooperation as fellow Imperial servants. Instead, the Space Marines opened fire immediately upon detecting us, their weapons batteries launching without warning or communication attempt, their targeting clearly indicating intention to destroy rather than disable. We were forced to engage our defensive systems, deploying our Daemon engines, and returning fire while attempting to establish communication and explain that we were loyal Imperial forces being attacked by mistake. The Space Marines ignored our hails and pressed their attack with determination that suggested they knew exactly what they were engaging. It took us nearly 6 hours of running combat before we managed to disable their vessels sufficiently to force withdrawal. And during that entire engagement, they never responded to our communication attempts beyond a single transmission that we initially did not understand. Traitor Mechanicum will find no mercy. The Emperor's judgment is death. Traitor Mechanicum. They had classified us as Chaos forces immediately upon detecting us, without investigation or communication, based purely on what they observed about our fleet's appearance and capabilities. We were horrified by this categorization because we knew we remained loyal to the Imperium despite our unorthodox methods. We were not traitors. We were innovators, pragmatists who employed controversial techniques for superior results, but who maintained fundamental loyalty to the Emperor and the Omnissiah. The Space Marines were simply wrong, misled by surface appearances into attacking fellow Imperial servants, unable to recognize that methodology did not determine loyalty. Except when we reviewed the engagement data and examined our fleet through external sensor perspectives, we began to understand why the Space Marines had not hesitated before attacking. Our ships looked like Chaos vessels, covered in spikes and brass trim, employing warp field technology, launching Daemon engines into combat. Our communication attempts had used technical terminology that blended Imperial and Chaos language. Our defensive tactics had followed patterns learned from the Iron Warriors. To any external observer with no context about our history or intentions, we were indistinguishable from Chaos Mechanicum forces. Our loyalty existed in our thoughts and self-perception, but it was invisible in our actions and appearance. We had become externally what we had spent 2 decades insisting we were not internally, and the cognitive dissonance was becoming impossible to maintain through rationalization. This cycle has repeated across history, traders becoming what they trade with. If you think loyalty is more than appearance, let your engagement prove conviction can survive corruption. Like and subscribe. Magos Logis Tharank conducted a comprehensive analysis of our fleet's status during year 202,000, attempting to objectively assess how far we had diverged from orthodox Mechanicus practice and whether our self-identification as loyal explorators remained accurate. His report was devastating in its logical precision. Fleet aesthetic, 97% convergence with Chaos Mechanicum design patterns. Technical practices, 84% divergence from Cult Mechanicus orthodox doctrine. Equipment composition, 63% of active systems employ technologies classified as heretical by Martian authority. Personnel ideology, 71% of senior tech priests express beliefs inconsistent with orthodox Mechanicus theology, including treating technology as something to be innovated rather than preserved, valuing practical function over ritual purity, and maintaining regular positive contact with Chaos forces. Combat capabilities, 40% dependent on Daemon engines or warp technology classified as forbidden. Conclusion. Explorator Fleet Tertius, 9 meets objective criteria for classification as Chaos Mechanicum in all assessments except self-reported loyalty. Loyalty claims cannot be externally verified and are contradicted by observable behavior patterns across all measurable categories. Probability that Mars would classify us as traitors if full operational details were reported, 90 to 9.8%. The report forced confrontation with truth we had been avoiding through increasingly strained rationalization. We were chaos mechanicum in practice, if not belief, corrupted through gradual compromise that had transformed us so completely that the distinction between what we claimed to be and what we actually were had become meaningless. We had spent 22 years telling ourselves that methodology did not determine loyalty, that pragmatic cooperation with chaos forces did not constitute alliance, that employing forbidden technologies did not make us heretics if we maintained proper mental reservations about their origins. We had been wrong. Corruption was not a moment of conscious betrayal. It was the accumulated weight of 10,000 small compromises, each one individually justifiable, collectively damning. Some of us wanted to return to Mars immediately, confess everything, and accept whatever judgment the fabricator general would render. Others argued that confession would accomplish nothing except our execution and the loss of all the valuable technology we had recovered over 2 decades of exploration. Magos Technicus Vorath proposed a third option. We were already damned by orthodox standards, but damnation did not require accepting chaos worship. We could continue operating as independent explorators, pursuing technology wherever we found it, serving the ideal of knowledge advancement rather than the specific political structure of Mars. We would be heretics by definition, but heretics motivated by the same goals that drove orthodox Mechanicus: recovery and preservation of sacred technology. The distinction might not satisfy Mars, but it satisfied us. The decision to not return to Mars was made collectively over 3 months of debate and analysis. We understood that this choice represented final acceptance of our status as rogue explorators, formally severing our connection to Martian authority and accepting classification as heretics by any Imperial force we encountered. We also understood that attempting to return would likely result in our destruction before we could present our recovered technology, that the Space Marine's attack had demonstrated how we would be received, and that our best option for accomplishing anything useful with the knowledge we had gained was to continue operating independently and potentially establish contact with more radical Mechanicus factions who might value our research. Despite our methods, we returned to the Hadros Rift and informed Warsmith Krendath of our situation. His response was characteristically pragmatic. You have finally recognized what you became years ago. Good. Self-awareness is the beginning of effectiveness. You are welcome to continue operating in this region. Your presence complicates Imperial intelligence assessments of our force disposition, and your trading remains profitable. Consider yourselves independent contractors with friendly relations to my warband. We may call upon you for technical services occasionally, and you may request military protection if you encounter threats you cannot handle independently. We had become what we hunted. Not through religious conversion or demonic possession, not through torture or corruption rituals, but through 22 years of rational economic relationships and pragmatic technical cooperation. We had traded with chaos until we adopted chaos practices, employed chaos technologies until we became reliant on them, learned from chaos sources until our knowledge base was inseparable from theirs. We had remained convinced of our loyalty throughout this process because loyalty was internal and invisible, while corruption was external and evident to everyone except ourselves. We were chaos mechanicum who still believed we served the Omniseer, heretics who insisted we remained faithful, traitors who genuinely did not understand why the Imperium would see us as enemies. The final recognition came during year 2007, when we encountered another Mechanicus Explorator fleet, the Pride of Voss, a proper Orthodox force that had been searching for us after Mars became concerned about our 2 decades of failed reporting schedules. They transmitted standard identification protocols, we responded in kind, and they attacked immediately without attempting negotiation or investigation. Their Magos Explorator transmitted a single message before opening fire. Traitor Fleet Tertius, 9, you stand condemned for tech heresy, corruption, and cooperation with the ruinous powers. The Omnisier's judgment is deletion. We destroyed the Pride of Voss in a 6-hour engagement, our Daemon engines and Chaos-derived weapon systems proving superior to their orthodox equipment. Our combat tactics, learned from the Iron Warriors, overwhelming their traditional mechanicist defensive patterns. We achieved total victory, suffering only minor damage to 2 escort vessels, while completely eliminating a force that should have been our brothers. As we examined the wreckage, extracting surviving data cores and recovering intact technology from their destroyed ships, I finally understood what we had become with a clarity that 27 years of rationalization had obscured. We were killers of loyal Mechanicus forces, employing chaos weapons against Imperial servants, operating as enemies of Mars in all but our own self-perception. Our loyalty existed nowhere except in our thoughts, and thoughts meant nothing when every action we took aligned with chaos interests and opposed Imperial ones. We had been corrupted so completely that we could murder our former brothers without hesitation, could loot their technology like pirates, could justify our actions through the same pragmatic rationalization that had justified every compromise over nearly 3 decades. We were damned, and our damnation was complete. Magos Logis Tharank's final report, filed 30 years after we first entered the Hadros Rift, contained a single conclusion that summarized our transformation with perfect logical precision. Fleet Tertius. 9 functions as Chaos Mechanicum Auxiliary Force. Original mission parameters abandoned. Original loyalty compromised beyond recovery. Current status, rogue explorators serving chaos interests through technological cooperation and occasional military support. Recommend, update fleet designation to acknowledge current allegiance. Self-deception serves no tactical purpose. We never updated our designation because doing so would require acknowledging truth we still struggled to accept. We remained Explorator Fleet Tertius, 9 in our own records. Loyal servants of the Omnissiah who happened to operate in chaos-controlled space, using chaos-derived technologies while maintaining friendly relations with traitor Legion forces, and occasionally fighting Imperial servants who mistakenly identified us as enemies. The cognitive dissonance was complete, and we maintained it through sheer force of denial, even as every objective assessment confirmed our corruption. As this nightmare reaches its conclusion, if any part of this moved you, give them what they never gave themselves, recognition of truth. Leave corrupted in the comments. I exist now as Magos Explorator of a rogue fleet that serves chaos in all but name, commanding 8,000 souls who were gradually corrupted through economic pragmatism rather than religious conversion, transformed through market forces and rational compromise into something indistinguishable from the enemies we once opposed. We operate throughout the Hadros Rift and adjacent regions, trading with Iron Warriors and other chaos forces, recovering ancient technology through methods that make us heretics by any Imperial standard, serving the goal of knowledge advancement in ways that benefit chaos interests more than Imperial ones. We maintain our original mission in theory. We still seek lost STCs, still research ancient technologies, still pursue the Omnissiah's mysteries, but our practice has diverged so far from orthodoxy that the theoretical loyalty is meaningless. We encounter Imperial forces occasionally, and the pattern is always the same. They identify us as Chaos Mechanicum. They attack immediately. We destroy them with weapons and tactics learned from actual Chaos Mechanicum. We loot their wreckage for technology and resources, justify our actions through pragmatic necessity, and continue operations without serious self-examination, because examining ourselves honestly would require acknowledging that we have become exactly what we spent 30 years insisting we were not. We are traitors who believe ourselves loyal, heretics who claim orthodoxy, servants of chaos who insist we serve the Emperor. The delusion is complete, maintained not through warp corruption or demonic influence, but through pure rational self-deception, the human capacity for motivated reasoning taken to its ultimate conclusion. The Iron Warriors find our situation amusing. Warsmith Krendath told me recently, during our most recent trade meeting, that we represent a perfect case study in corruption through pragmatism rather than ideology. We were never tortured, never possessed, never subjected to religious conversion. We simply made rational decisions that each seemed justified in isolation, but which collectively transformed us into chaos servants as complete as any cultist. We adopted their aesthetics because they were functionally efficient. We employed their technologies because they were objectively superior. We learned their techniques because they produced measurable results. We maintained friendly relations because conflict would have been wasteful. Each choice was logical. Each compromise was pragmatic. And 30 years of logical compromises produced a rogue Mechanicus fleet that functions as chaos auxiliary forces while genuinely believing we remain fundamentally loyal to the Imperium. The worst part is that we accomplished our mission. We recovered extensive STC technology, thousands of ancient designs and specifications that would revolutionize Imperial manufacturing if we could somehow return to Mars and deliver them. We possess knowledge that could save billions of Imperial lives, improve weapon systems, enhance production capacity, advance human technological capability by centuries. But we acquired this knowledge through cooperation with Chaos, preserved it using Chaos-derived technologies, and operate as de facto Chaos forces. Even if Mars would accept us back, which they would not, the technology we offer is inseparable from how we obtained it, tainted by association with sources that make it forbidden regardless of its practical value. We succeeded in our goal of advancing human knowledge while becoming traitors in the process, achieving our mission while losing our souls to pragmatism rather than malice. New tech priests join our fleet occasionally, rogue Mechanicus who have been declared heretical for unorthodox practices, exiles from Forge worlds, radical researchers who value knowledge over political acceptability. They arrive expecting chaos cultists and find something more disturbing. Loyalists who look like traitors, pragmatists who employ forbidden techniques while insisting on fundamental orthodoxy, explorators who genuinely believe we serve the Omnissiah, despite 30 years of cooperation with his enemies. Some of these newcomers integrate successfully into our operations, adopting our rationalization frameworks and contributing to our continued research. Others flee within weeks, disturbed not by our practices but by our delusions. Unable to tolerate the cognitive dissonance of watching tech priests employ demon engines while reciting prayers to the machine god without irony. I sometimes wonder if actual Chaos Mechanicum, those who consciously serve the dark gods and acknowledge their allegiance openly, view us with contempt or pity. We are corrupted without accepting our corruption, damned while claiming salvation, traitors who insist on loyalty with such conviction that even we cannot penetrate our own self-deception. We are worse than honest heretics because honest heretics understand what they are, while we maintain elaborate rationalizations that let us commit heresy while believing ourselves orthodox. We are the ultimate cautionary tale about how corruption progresses, not through dramatic moments of conscious betrayal, but through 30 years of pragmatic compromises that feel justified individually but accumulate into complete transformation. The Imperium has declared Explorator Fleet Tertius, 9 traitores perditas, traitors beyond redemption, to be destroyed on sight by any loyal forces. The declaration was issued 7 years ago according to intelligence we acquired from captured Imperial vessels, and it lists our crimes with clinical precision: cooperation with chaos forces, employment of forbidden technologies, murder of loyal Mechanicus personnel, tech heresy of the highest order, and heretical innovation that violates sacred preservation doctrines. Every charge is accurate, every accusation is supported by evidence we cannot dispute. We are exactly what the Imperium claims we are, and our insistence on fundamental loyalty is delusion maintained through motivated reasoning so profound that acknowledging truth would shatter our collective identity. But we continue operating because the alternative, accepting that we are traitors and either embracing chaos worship or committing mass suicide, is psychologically impossible after 30 years of practiced self-deception. We maintain our lies because truth is unendurable, preserve our rationalization frameworks because honest self-assessment would be devastating, and keep conducting research and recovering technology because it gives us purpose that makes our damnation feel meaningful. We are rogue explorators who became chaos mechanicum through economic pragmatism, corrupted by market forces rather than religious conversion, transformed by 30 years of seemingly rational decisions into something that externally serves chaos completely, while internally believing we remain loyal to the Imperium. This is what happens when an Explorator fleet trades with chaos for technology in Warhammer 40,000. We thought we could maintain professional distance, conduct business without adoption of beliefs, employ techniques without accepting ideologies. We were wrong. Corruption is not discrete. It is continuous, accumulating through tiny compromises that each seem harmless until you recognize you have transformed completely without ever making a conscious decision to betray anything. We remained convinced of our loyalty despite 30 years of evidence proving our treason, maintain our identities as Imperial servants despite functioning as Chaos auxiliaries, insist on orthodoxy despite practicing heresy in every measurable way. The Emperor protects, we still recite in our prayers, though we deploy demon engines while praying and employ chaos technologies while invoking his name. The Omnissiah guides our research, we still believe, though our research follows patterns learned from traitor legions and employs methods that make us heretics by Martian standards. We are loyal, we still insist, though every force loyal to the Imperium attacks us on sight, and we respond by destroying them with chaos weapons. Now you understand how corruption works through pragmatism rather than ideology. If you dare witness more truths about damnation through rationalization, subscribe. The Emperor protects, except from logical compromise. I am Magos Explorator Veridin Cross, 40% of my original designation at this point in my transformation, commanding a rogue fleet that serves chaos while believing we serve the Imperium. Having spent 30 years being corrupted through economic relationships and rational compromise until becoming indistinguishable from actual traitor mechanicum, except in our own self-perception. I accomplished my mission of recovering lost technology. I advanced human knowledge significantly. I contributed to technological progress that will benefit someone, though not the Imperium I claimed to serve, because I became its enemy through 1,000 pragmatic decisions that seemed justified at the time. This is my testimony. This is my warning. This is what happens when you believe methodology does not determine loyalty, when you think you can trade with chaos without being changed, when you convince yourself that pragmatic cooperation with enemies is different from alliance. Corruption does not require religious conversion or demonic possession. It simply requires enough small compromises, enough rational justifications, enough cognitive flexibility to redefine loyalty until it becomes meaningless. We are traitors who insist on loyalty with such conviction that we murder Imperial forces while believing we remain fundamentally faithful. We are the ultimate warning about how corruption progresses when you substitute pragmatism for principles and convince yourself that results justify methodology regardless of source. Learn from our damnation. Recognize that trading with chaos makes you chaos eventually, that employing their techniques transforms you into them, that maintaining professional distance is impossible when you spend decades cooperating with enemies and adopting their practices. We thought we were different. We thought we could remain pure while becoming impure. We were wrong, and our wrongness was so complete that 30 years later we still struggle to acknowledge it honestly. The Emperor protects. But sometimes he cannot protect you from yourself, from your own rational decisions, from the slow corruption of compromise that feels justified every step of the way, until you discover you have walked so far down the path of damnation that return is impossible, and you have forgotten why you ever wanted to return. Anyway, may he judge us more mercifully than we deserve. May he recognize what we intended, even if he cannot forgive what we became. May he understand that we remained loyal in our hearts, even as every action we took served his enemies. Or may he simply delete us from existence because what we have become, traitors who believe themselves loyal, is more contemptible than honest corruption could ever be. This is forever. This is what we are. This is damnation through rational compromise, corruption through economic pragmatism, treason through 30 years of logical decisions that transformed imperial servants into chaos auxiliaries who still pray to the emperor while deploying demon engines in his name.